The father's justice. 6 years of my life. 6 years of bad coffee, controlled smiles, and swallowing words I should have said out loud. All of it ended with a single phone call while I was standing on a balcony in Paris, watching the city wake up like it had nothing to prove to anyone. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I didn't even need to look at the screen to know it was Stephen Caldwell. I answered anyway, calm, steady, already prepared for what was coming. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through an ocean. I leaned against the railing, looking out over the Seine, letting him talk. There was no surprise in me, not even irritation, just a quiet sense of timing, finally aligning. I'd been working under Stephen Caldwell for 6 years. 6 long, carefully measured years, and from the very beginning, he made it clear exactly where I stood in his world. Not beside him. Never that. Always beneath him. The first time Lauren introduced me to him, he didn't shake my hand like an equal. He held it just long enough to evaluate me, like I was something he might return later if I didn't perform as expected. "So this is the guy," he said, barely hiding the disappointment in his voice. "You're in consulting, right?" I told him yes. He nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't acknowledge your answer, only files it away under unimpressive. That was the beginning. It never improved. At the office, he had a way of speaking to me that sounded polite to outsiders. But everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. "Ryan's still learning," he would say during meetings, even when I was the one presenting the numbers. Or worse, "Let's have someone with leadership experience weigh in." Said, someone with leadership experience. After 6 years of running operations. After 6 years of fixing problems no one else could solve. After 6 years of carrying a weight he never even acknowledged. And then there were the smaller things, the constant, grinding reminders, calling me kid in front of junior staff, questioning decisions he hadn't even read, rewriting emails just to assert control, laughing at stories that weren't funny, and expecting me to laugh along, which I did, for a while. Because when you work for your father-in-law, it's never just about the job. It's about proving, every single day, that you belong somewhere he's already decided you don't. It's about sitting at dinner tables where business and family blur together, and realizing that in both rooms, you're still the outsider. And Stephen Caldwell thrived on that imbalance. He needed it. He built his authority on it. So I learned to adapt. I learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to let him think he'd won. Because here's the thing about being underestimated. If you're patient enough, it becomes an advantage. Back in Paris, his voice kept going. Louder now, angrier, unraveling, in real time. "You come back tonight," he said. "You hear me? Or don't bother coming back at all. You're done." There it was. Clean, final, exactly what I needed. I closed my eyes for just a second, not out of frustration, but to take in the moment I'd been building toward for 2 years. Then I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. "All right," I said quietly. And before he could finish whatever came next, I hung up. It didn't start in Paris, and it didn't start with that phone call either. It started on a quiet afternoon, the kind that disappears if nothing important happens. Except something did. I was standing in a cramped records room on the 18th floor, half bent over a filing cabinet that hadn't been organized properly in years. The fluorescent light above me flickered just enough to be annoying, and I remember thinking how perfectly that matched the rest of the place, functional but careless underneath the surface. I was looking for a vendor contract someone swore had been filed correctly, which usually meant it wasn't. Drawer after drawer, folders stacked tight, labels fading with age, until my hand brushed against something that didn't belong. A thicker folder, older, heavier. The tab was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged but still readable. Caldwell Equity Group, Founding Charter, 1987. I almost put it back, almost. But there's a moment, sometimes, when instinct speaks before logic catches up, and instead of sliding it back into place, I pulled it out and sat down. The documents inside were dense, legal language layered on top of legal language, the kind designed to be skimmed, not studied. But I didn't skim. I read every page, slowly, carefully, because something about it felt important in a way I couldn't explain yet. And then I found it. Buried deep in the middle of the document, Section 14, subsection C, written in the same neutral tone as everything else, but carrying something entirely different beneath it. Any employee, with no fewer than 5 consecutive years of full-time service, terminated without documented cause, shall be entitled to equity compensation equivalent to 18% of the company's total. Shares valued at the time of termination. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. Because at some point, I stopped reading and started calculating. 5 years, no cause, 18%. I leaned back in that chair and just sat there for a long time, not moving, not thinking in sentences, just letting the numbers settle into place. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was structured. It was written, signed, binding. And more importantly, it was overlooked. That night, I met Kevin Hayes at a bar we'd been going to for years, the kind of place where nobody asks questions and the bartender remembers what you drink before you sit down. I didn't ease into it. I didn't soften it. I just laid it out exactly as it was. If I get fired after 5 years without cause, I said, keeping my voice low and controlled, I walk away with 18% of the company. Kevin didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, like he was trying to decide if I was serious or if I'd finally lost my patience in a way that couldn't be fixed. You've been there how long now? He asked. 4 years, and change. He let out a slow breath, shook his head slightly, then leaned forward. Ryan, that's not a clause. That's a payout. It's more than that, I said. He frowned. How is that more? I held his gaze, steady, certain, already past the point of doubt. Because it's not chance, I said. It's predictable. He still didn't get it. Not fully. So I said it the way it needed to be said. This isn't luck. I paused just long enough to let it land. This is leverage. And in that moment, everything shifted. Once I understood the clause, really understood it, the plan didn't feel reckless. It felt precise. There was no room for improvisation, no space for ego. If this was going to work, it had to be controlled down to the smallest detail. Because one mistake, one documented slip, and the entire structure would collapse before it even had a chance to stand. So I built the first layer, the only way it could be built, flawlessly. For the next 2 years, my record became untouchable. Every report is submitted early, every metric exceeded, every performance review is documented, signed, and archived. I made sure there was nothing in my file that could be interpreted as negligence, insubordination, or even inconsistency. I didn't just meet expectations, I removed any argument that I hadn't, because the clause was clear. No cause. And no cause only exists when there's nothing to point at. But perfection alone wasn't enough. In fact, perfection would have protected me too well. Stephen Caldwell didn't fire people who made him look good. He kept them close, used them, controlled them. I didn't need him to value me. I needed him to want me gone. That was the second layer, and it required something much more delicate. I started asking questions, not aggressive ones, not confrontational, just precise. In meetings, I would bring data, clean, undeniable numbers, and frame them as clarification. Can you walk me through the projection on this segment? I'd ask, knowing full well the projection didn't hold up under scrutiny. To anyone else, it sounded professional. To Stephen, it felt like resistance. And resistance, to a man like him, was worse than open defiance. I stopped reacting the way he expected. When he made his usual comments, the subtle jabs dressed as advice, I didn't laugh anymore. Not even politely. I acknowledged, then moved on. No validation, no performance. Just silence where approval used to be. It bothered him more than I thought it would. Because men like Stephen Caldwell don't just want obedience, they want reflection. They want to see themselves echoed back in the people around them. And I stopped being a mirror. Then there was time. I started arriving at exactly 9, not 8:57, not 8:55, 9. And I left at 5. Every day. No exceptions. No lingering. No visible urgency to prove I belonged there beyond the work itself. In a normal company, that's discipline. In Stephen's world, that was defiance. He noticed. Of course, he noticed. He notices everything that threatens his sense of control. "You've been different lately," he said to me one morning, standing in the doorway of my office like he owned the air inside it. "Just focused," I replied. "Calm, neutral, no edge." He studied me for a second longer than necessary, like he was trying to find the crack that wasn't there. I didn't give him one. That was the balance. And it had to be exact. Too soft, and he'd ignore me. Too aggressive, and he'd document it. So I stayed right in the middle. Competent, precise, uncomfortable. I made sure every move could be defended. And every reaction from him couldn't. And slowly, almost invisibly, the shift began. Not in the numbers, not in the reports. In him. His tone changed. Shorter, sharper, less patient. Meetings where he used to talk over me became meetings where he watched me, waiting, measuring, because something felt off to him. He just couldn't prove what it was. And that was the entire point. For 2 years, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break protocol. I didn't step out of line in any way that could be written down. But I made myself impossible to tolerate. Not by being wrong, but by being exactly right in ways he couldn't control. To understand why the plan worked, you have to understand Lauren. Because this was never just my strategy. It was her history. And her history with Stephen Caldwell didn't begin in boardrooms or balance sheets. It began at a dinner table where silence meant survival. Stephen never raised his hand. That's what people like to say when they describe men like him, as if the absence of bruises somehow means the absence of damage. But what he did was quieter, more controlled, and far harder to prove. He corrected Lauren's mother in front of guests. Not loudly, just enough to make her hesitate the next time she spoke. He questioned her choices, her spending, her tone, until every decision she made felt like something that needed permission. It wasn't chaos, it was structured. A system built on making one person smaller so another could feel larger. Lauren grew up inside that system. She watched it unfold night after night. The way her mother's shoulders would tighten at certain words. The way conversations would shift when Stephen entered a room. The way silence became a form of protection. And she learned something most people don't learn until much later. You don't always fight power head-on. Sometimes, you outlast it. Her mother eventually left, packed quietly, filed for divorce, and endured a process that Stephen turned into another form of control. Legal delays, financial pressure, drawn-out negotiations, not because he needed the outcome, but because he needed to win. Lauren never forgot that. She maintained a relationship with him, because walking away completely would have cost her more than it cost him. But she didn't forgive him. Not in the way people expect. There was no clean resolution, no emotional closure, just a quiet decision to remember everything and wait. So when I brought the documents home that night, when I spread the founding charter across the kitchen table and showed her Section 14, subsection C, I expected questions, doubt, maybe even fear. I didn't get any of that. She read it once, then again, slower. Her eyes didn't widen. Her expression didn't change. She understood it immediately, because she wasn't reading the words. She was reading the leverage. "He's never looked at this, has he?" she said finally. Not as a question, but as a conclusion. "He inherited everything," I replied. She nodded slightly, almost to herself, like something long unresolved had just found its shape. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, just focused. Then she looked up at me. Not emotional, not angry, just clear. "What do you need from me?" That was the moment the plan became real. Because this wasn't about convincing her. She was already there. What she offered in that question wasn't just support. It was alignment. Strategy and emotion are moving in the same direction. She didn't need to be told what Stephen was capable of. She'd lived it. She didn't need to be persuaded that he would cross a line if pushed correctly. She'd watched him do it her entire life. And more importantly, she didn't need revenge in the way people usually think about it. She needed balance. Not loud, not dramatic. Just exact. So we sat there, two people at the same table where, years earlier, she'd learned how to stay quiet while her father spoke over everything that mattered. And we built something different. Not a confrontation. A structure. One that didn't rely on emotion, even though it came from it. One that didn't require force, because it used his own behavior against him. Lauren didn't raise her voice. She didn't revisit old arguments. She didn't try to change him. She simply stepped into position and waited with me. And in that stillness, that patience, that refusal to forget, the outcome was already beginning to take shape. The idea didn't come from me. It came from Lauren, which is exactly why it worked. Plans like this don't survive on logic alone. They need instinct, timing, and an understanding of human weakness that can't be learned from a spreadsheet. And Lauren understood Stephen Caldwell better than anyone alive. Not as a CEO, but as a man whose ego had been fed for decades, without ever being challenged in a way that mattered. She brought it up casually, the way she always did when something important was about to happen. Sunday dinner, long table, controlled conversation. Stephen sat at the head like he owned not just the house, but the air inside it. "Ryan hasn't taken a real vacation in 6 years," she said, refilling her glass without looking at him directly. "I think we should go to Paris. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Not a weekend, not a short trip. A full absence." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. This was her move, and she placed it exactly where it would be seen, but not immediately understood. Stephen paused just slightly, knife mid-cut, the smallest disruption in his rhythm. 2 weeks is a long time to be away from responsibilities, he said, voice controlled, but already tightening around the edges. HR already approved it, Lauren replied smoothly. All documentation is in place. Coverage has been arranged. That was the setup, clean, documented, untouchable. Everything about it was legitimate, which meant if he reacted, it wouldn't be because of policy. It would be because of control. We landed in Paris on a quiet morning, the kind that makes everything feel distant from whatever you left behind. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking emails every hour. I wasn't measuring my tone, adjusting my posture, anticipating someone else's reaction. But that didn't mean the plan stopped. It was already in motion. Day 2, I sent a photo. Nothing aggressive. Just the Eiffel Tower at sunset, captioned simply enough to sound harmless. Incredible city. No response. Day 4, I had a meeting pushed. Legitimate reason, fully documented, but I knew exactly how information moved inside that company. It didn't stay contained. It flowed upward, quietly, inevitably, until it reached him. Day 6, Lauren sent a short video from a rooftop dinner. Laughter, light, movement. The kind of moment Stephen never allowed himself to have, and never tolerated in others if it interrupted his expectations. That was when the shift happened. Not visible, not immediate, but building. Because to someone like Stephen Caldwell, absence isn't neutral. It's a threat. By day 8, I didn't need to check my phone to know it was coming. The pattern was predictable. The silence had stretched just long enough to turn into irritation, and irritation, left alone, always becomes action. I was standing on the balcony, coffee in hand, watching the city move without urgency, when my phone rang. Lauren looked up from the bed, didn't ask who it was, just met my eyes and gave a small nod. This was it. I answered. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" There it was. No pretense. No restraint. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. Let the frustration build into something sharper, something irreversible. He talked about responsibility, about leadership, about how the company couldn't function without constant oversight. Every word circling the same point without saying it directly. Control. You get back here tonight, he said finally, voice rising just enough to break his own pattern. Or don't bother coming back at all. You're done. Silence. Not from him, from me. Because in that moment, everything aligned. Approved leave. No documented cause. 6 years of flawless performance. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. Just confirmation. I let out a quiet breath. Something between a laugh and something older than that. Something that had been building long before Paris ever entered the picture. Then I ended the call. No argument, no explanation. Just the sound of the line going dead. Lauren was already standing by the door. Did he say it? I nodded once, every word. She stepped closer, took the coffee from my hand, sipped it as if nothing had changed, then gave it back. Outside, the city moved the same way it always does. Steady, indifferent, untouched by the collapse of smaller kingdoms happening far away. And for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't inside his. For most people, getting fired would have been the moment everything collapsed. Panic, anger, the instinct to call back and fix it before it became real. But as I stood there on that balcony in Paris, phone still warm in my hand, I felt none of that. No rush of adrenaline, no need to explain. Just a quiet, steady clarity settling into place. Like a door I'd been building for 2 years, had finally closed exactly the way it was designed to. I let out a soft breath, something close to a laugh, but without humor, not because it was funny, but because it was done. All the tension, all the careful restraint, all the calculated patience, it had led here. Not to a confrontation, not to a victory speech. Just a sentence, spoken in anger, that carried more weight than he could ever take back. I lowered the phone and looked out across the city again. Paris didn't change. The river kept moving. The light stayed the same. There was something almost grounding about that. The realization that even the moment you've been waiting for doesn't stop the world around you. It just changes where you stand in it. Behind me, I heard movement. Lauren stepped into the doorway, her presence quiet, composed, the same way it had been from the beginning. She didn't rush. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. "Did he say it?" she asked. I turned slightly, meeting her eyes. There was no urgency in the question, just precision. "Every word," I replied. She held my gaze for a second longer, not surprised, not relieved, just confirming what we both understood. Then she walked toward me, reached for the coffee still in my hand, and took a sip as if this was just another morning, another moment, nothing out of place. That was the difference. There was no celebration, no visible reaction, just stillness. Because what had happened wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of what came next. Most people would have cut the trip short, packed up, rushed home to deal with the fallout, but there was nothing to fix, nothing to manage. Everything that needed to happen already had. So we didn't leave. We stayed exactly where we were. That afternoon, we walked along the river. No phones, no emails, no checking for updates from a world that had just shifted without us needing to be there to watch it happen. We sat at a small cafe that didn't know our names, ordered without thinking too much about it, and let the time pass the way it's supposed to when there's nothing left to control. And underneath all of it, there was something else. Not excitement, not even satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that somewhere, far away, Stephen Caldwell was already trying to regain control of something that had slipped through his hands the moment he lost his temper. He just didn't know it yet. But we did. And that was enough. Monday morning arrived without ceremony, just another quiet shift in a timeline that had already moved past the point of return. I walked back into the building at 8:59, same entrance, same elevator, same 18th floor, but everything about it felt different. Not because the place had changed, but because I had. People noticed. They always do. Conversations slowed, eyes followed, not openly, just enough to register that something wasn't where it used to be. I didn't stop. I didn't explain. I walked straight through the reception area and into the conference room where Stephen Caldwell was already waiting, surrounded by the same structure he had relied on for years. Except this time, it wasn't entirely his. Natalie Brooks walked in beside me, early 50s, composed, the kind of presence that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. She didn't look around the room. She didn't acknowledge the tension. She simply set her portfolio on the table and began distributing printed copies. Clean, bound, deliberate. Section 14, subsection C, she said calmly. No build-up, no introduction. Just the point. The room shifted, not visibly, but you could feel it. Papers turned, eyes dropped. Silence expanded in a way that only happens when something unexpected becomes unavoidable. Jason Reed sat halfway down the table, reviewing the document with the focus of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and what it meant. He didn't rush. He didn't react emotionally. When he finally looked up, his expression was neutral, but certain. "It's valid," he said. 2 words. That was all it took. Stephen didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened. The controlled version of anger, the kind he used when he still believed he could steer the outcome. "This is a misinterpretation," he said, voice steady but edged. "A clause taken out of context." Natalie didn't move. "It's a clause written into your founding documents," she replied. "And your termination of Mr. Carter meets every condition required for enforcement." The air in the room grew heavier, not loud, not chaotic, just dense with the weight of something settling into place. Stephen's attention shifted to me, not as an employee anymore, but as a problem. "You never belonged here," he said quietly. "You were given a position you didn't earn, and now you think you're entitled to something you had no part in building." It wasn't about the clause anymore. It was about control, slipping. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because at that moment, the door opened. Lauren stepped in. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the center of the room with the same measured pace she had carried for years, the same control that had been built long before this moment. Every eye turned. She looked at Stephen, not as a CEO, not even as a father, but as something she had already understood and moved past. "I watched you dismantle her," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying further than anything raised in anger ever could. "Every dinner, every conversation, every time you made her feel like she needed permission to exist in her own home." The room stayed silent. "I watched her leave," Lauren continued, "and I watched you spend years trying to prove that leaving was the mistake, not what she was leaving behind." Stephen didn't interrupt. For the first time, he didn't control the space. "You did the same thing here," she said, glancing briefly around the table. "Different setting, same pattern, and now you're surprised that someone finally decided not to play along." She stepped back, not dramatically, just enough to return the focus to where it had always been. The clause. Melissa Grant, seated at the far end of the table, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the document one last time. She didn't rush either. People like her never do. "All in favor of recognizing Mr. Carter's claim under Section 14, subsection C," she said. Hands went up, one by one. No hesitation, no discussion. The decision didn't feel loud. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt final. Stephen didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Because there was nothing left to control. And for the first time in that room, he understood it. What ended in that boardroom didn't explode. It settled. That's how real consequences arrive. Not with noise, but with weight. The vote didn't just recognize a clause. It changed the direction of everything that followed. And once it shifted, it kept moving. At first, it was quiet. Emails sent after hours. Messages were forwarded to the right people instead of the safe ones. Names that had stayed silent for years began to surface. Not all at once, but steadily. One complaint became two. Two became a pattern. Patterns became records. Former employees came forward, not dramatically, not looking for attention, just facts, terminations that never quite made sense, reviews that changed overnight, conversations that had no witnesses but left a consistent imprint when told by different people who had never met each other. Legal filings followed, not a single case meant to take him down, but several that, together, created something heavier than any one argument could carry. Hostile work environment, wrongful termination, discriminatory practices that had been filed before and stalled, now moving again because the resistance that had held them back was no longer intact. Inside the company, the shift was just as precise. Melissa Grant didn't make speeches. She didn't need to. Authority, when it's real, doesn't perform. It acts. Meetings were called. Reviews were initiated. Documents were requested that hadn't been requested in years, not as accusations, just as a process. And process, applied consistently, reveals what personality tries to hide. Stephen Caldwell remained in his office during those first days, still positioned at the top of a structure that had begun to move without him. He took calls. He issued instructions. He tried to reassert control in the only way he knew how, by tightening it. But control only works when people agree to operate within it. And that agreement was gone. The board didn't rush. They didn't confront him in anger. They evaluated. They measured. They compared what was documented with what had been tolerated. And the gap between those two things became impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, the conclusion didn't need to be announced. It had already been reached. Stephen Caldwell was removed from his position as CEO. Not publicly, not ceremonially, just formally. A decision recorded in minutes. Signed, filed, and enacted. He resisted at first when it came to his equity. Not loudly, not emotionally. Just in the way someone resists when they understand exactly what they're losing but still hope the structure might hold a little longer. It didn't. Because this wasn't about opinion anymore. It was about exposure. And exposure, once it reaches a certain point, doesn't reverse. His legal team advised him the way professionals do when the outcome is no longer negotiable. Numbers replaced arguments. Risk replaced pride. And eventually, he signed. The transfer of his shares happened without cameras, without statements, without recognition. Just a document placed on a table, reviewed, executed, and absorbed into a system that had already adjusted to his absence. Melissa Grant oversaw the transition with the same consistency she had shown from the beginning. No commentary, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary to keep everything moving forward. Because that's what institutions do when they survive something like this. They don't look back, they stabilize. And Stephen, for a man who had spent decades shaping the environment around him, the final outcome wasn't loud enough to match the scale of what he lost. There was no moment that defined it. Just a series of decisions, each one small on its own, that, together, left him with nothing left to control. By the time everything settled, the numbers were clear, the structure had shifted, and the outcome no longer needed to be argued. 18% of the company sat in front of me, not as an idea anymore, but as something real, something measurable, something most people would spend a lifetime trying to reach. And for a brief moment, I considered what it would mean to keep it, to stay, to step into the space that had just been vacated. But that had never been the point. I met with Melissa Grant 2 weeks later in a quiet office that felt nothing like the boardroom where everything changed. No tension, no audience. Just terms, numbers, and a decision that had already been made long before I sat down. She made a fair offer. More than fair. The kind of number that doesn't need to be negotiated when you understand exactly what you came for. I signed. Clean. Final. No hesitation. Later that evening, Kevin called me, his voice somewhere between disbelief and admiration. "You're walking away from all of it?" he asked. "After everything?" I leaned back in my chair, looking across the kitchen at Lauren, who was already packing the last of what we needed. The same table, the same place where this had all started, now quiet again, but different. "I never wanted the company," I said. There was a pause on the line. "I wanted the moment." And that was the truth. It was never about ownership, never about control. It was about balance, about taking something that had been used to diminish others for years and turning it, carefully, precisely, into something that couldn't be ignored. A few weeks later, we left. No announcement, no explanation, just a decision made between two people who no longer needed to stay, where they had already finished what they came to do. Lauren stood by the window one last time before we closed the door behind us, her expression calm, lighter, in a way I hadn't seen before. Not because something had been taken, but because something had finally been set down. We didn't look back, because some victories don't need to be revisited to be understood. And if there's anything this taught me, it's this. Money can build power, but it can't protect you from the consequences of how you use it. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's discipline, the space where you prepare the one move that matters. And patience, real patience, isn't about waiting. It's about building something so precise that when the moment comes, it doesn't need force. It just needs to be allowed to happen. So let me ask you this. If you had the chance to take everything back, not with anger, not with revenge, but with timing and control, would you wait long enough to do it right?